pastors to come in and pray with him on a regular basis.
Yes, you do.
And people said, well, but he didn't go to church. In fact, I had somebody on Facebook tell me there early on when Biden say, well, Biden goes to church. President Trump never went to church. Well, one of the reasons he didn't go was he didn't want to disrupt the services. But he had pastors coming in and praying with him frequently.
Yes, he
There
did.
was one meeting where shortly after he claims to have been saved, that they were supposed to have a relatively short meeting with a bunch of evangelical pastors, ministers of some sort, and they were supposed to be there for a short period of time, and it went on and ended up going on for over an hour. I mean, a lot longer than what it was supposed to go. And you know, he was there, and he had people with their hands on his head and shoulders praying and everything, and he didn't get up and move and say, well, we got to cut this short, enough of this. So something seems to have happened, but I would say this: he never really was under strong Bible teaching and preaching on a regular basis. And I don't know how much time he had, you know, to study and everything on his own too. Yes.
I heard an interview that he had given kind of his testimony, and I understand that unless you're really taught, sometimes the language,
Right.
but I did not hear a clear testimony of salvation, even like that Roger Stone, who's kind of in those circles, and he gave a very lengthy testimony of his salvation, and I'm like, that's not salvation. So I often think about like how Constantine, when he came to get the kingdom united, he Christianized a lot of paganism, and then you look at Revelation where you kind of see that harlot church, how the government's going to use like religion to further its, and Jesus always said, don't be deceived, don't be deceived.
Oh yeah.
And you give people opportunities, but when I heard their testimony, it had a works feel to it. And I mean, I'm not saying he is or
I know
isn't.
those are things we have to consider with anybody, really, because and again, that could go back to really a lack of discipleship and things.
But you kind of know.
Yeah.
I mean, when you give your, I mean, it's so simple. I'm lost, I'm on my way to hell, and I could do nothing. I mean, in order to be saved, you have to understand the gospel. You have to understand your condition, and you don't have to have all that doctrinal language. But you're lost and on your way to hell, and there's nothing. But I didn't hear that.
And
So
and
I
to be
don't
honest,
know.
this is years after the fact. I'm trying to remember things that we discussed, like 6 years ago now, probably, or 5, 6 years ago, where there were some things where he did actually use some language that would be more that way, and other things. And so, for me, it's always come back, well, do I see any evidence? And I think there's evidence of a changed life. But ultimately, do we know? We really don't. We have the testimony of some people who were there that said that he did all of that. He confessed that he was a sinner, and he put his faith in Jesus Christ as his Savior, because he believed that Jesus died on the cross and paid for his sins. So there's people who said that he went through that. Does he clearly articulate that since then? I would agree with you. He really doesn't clearly articulate it. But by the same token, I would say there's also a lot of Christians who don't clearly articulate it too.
Amen.
And could he have been doing it to manipulate people? That's entirely possible. He wouldn't be the first if that's the case. But we do see evidence that still continues to this day suggesting that there's something there. Like I said, suggesting. So that's why I'm not going to say absolutely 100% that man is born again, but I see enough evidence that, to me, on the balance, I think it argues that he is saved. That's just, I'm going by accumulating, like you do in a court, you know, enough evidence to make it more reasonable to believe this way or that way. And I think there's enough evidence to make it more reasonable to believe that he is saved than that he isn't saved, but he's just fooling people. Because there's a lot of stuff in private that he does that people who have worked with him, Secret Service, you know, aides and things like that have worked with him in private, that have said, you know, there's a difference in the man. So,
when we were in the Catholic Church and in a prayer group, and the people there could outshine any Christian.
oh yeah,
They were,
absolutely.
and they would say they're born again. But when you ask, when were you born again? Well, I was born again when I was baptized. So unless you have that opportunity to really, because the language they're using, and I'm not saying that, because they really believe they're saved. I don't think it's they're tricking anybody, even if President Trump.
Well, some people have been fooled themselves, like you're saying.
Well, they really believe.
Yeah, they believe they are,
They
even
really
though they're
believe
not.
they're
Yeah.
Christians, and so I guess what you know, it's always best to hear it out of their own mouth, and you listen carefully, and you don't have to be, like I said, you don't have to have all the language right, but it's, you know what saved you. You know what you were, you know where you were going, and you know who saved you.
Yeah.
That's as simple, and I didn't hear that. I didn't hear that from Roger Stone either, you know, and he's a real big influencer in the religious circles, and I'm like, oh, that's not good.
And that is a danger in a lot of evangelical Christianity, is to hear what we want to hear, see what we want to see. And that's why, again, I can't say with absolute certainty that he is. I'm just saying, when I look at, you know, testimony of others, things that he's said, and more importantly, things that he's done, and compare that with things he said and done in the past, it suggests to me that it's more likely that he's saved than he's not. I guess I'll take a firm stance on me. Towards he is. And I got Chris in the back there.
Okay, I'm trying to think. He was the preacher over there in Germany. Hitler basically told him to shut up or I'm gonna kill you. And
Bonhoeffer.
Yeah, Bonhoeffer. I couldn't get her name. I had it and it just went away. He got up there and you could tell that he was saved because he started telling the people of Germany, do not let the government become the church.
Yeah.
And you look at what Joe Biden's doing right now, and it's like, wow.
Well,
And
the things that he
goes,
doesn't
"I'm a
say don't
Christian."
argue
It's
for
like, no,
salvation.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I personally haven't seen any of these other, you're talking about all these eyewitnesses and all that can vouch for him being a born again Christian. And so I'm a little leery about that. So, I mean, we were talking, Max and I were talking about 2 Timothy 3:5, having the form of godliness, but, you know, so playing the part, et cetera, et cetera. And one last thing, getting back to the Billy Graham thing, he probably knew all these people they were going into were communists and all these other things, but that's what the apostles did as well. They knew these were non-believers and believed everything else, so I don't see any fault in them knowing.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Their view
hoping
was,
to
this is
save
the
people.
cost of being able to go.
Right, I think they went in knowing. It's not like they denied Christ by going in there, because, you know,
Well,
an old joke was, where would Jesus come if he came today? Would he go in a church or would he go to a bar?
But Jesus would not be recognizing those people as Christians, because he recognized these people that he knew were atheists as his Christian brothers.
He did?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that.
So, I mean, it's just, there's things like that, but in his mind, I think he thought he was doing the right thing.
Right.
And again, you know, none of us are perfect. And there are, let's just take an issue like this, King James Bible. Does everybody that rejects a King James Bible as being the only English translation, is everybody that does that lost?
Nope.
There's a lot of godly people out there who just don't get it.
Yeah.
they just don't see what we see when we talk about the King James Bible. To them, it's either a complete non-issue or it's worse. I had one guy, a pastor in church, when I was a missionary, I contacted this one church, and he wanted to know what my position on the King James Bible was. Now, generally speaking, when somebody asks that, it's because they're King James only. They're probably on the same page like Pastor Snacko or
Right.
Pastor Folger at Cleveland Baptist, or us here, or Pastor Lutz at North Coast, different ones that we all, we know. And so I said, well, I'm King James only, and I gave my reasons, and he said, well, I can't have you come to our church because I think people like you are doing more to harm the cause of Christ
Oh my goodness.
than anybody else. He said, I would take any translation, even if it was written by Satan himself, as long as it's accurate.
Oh my goodness.
A pastor of an independent Baptist church told me that.
Wow.
Anybody remember Dr. John Francis?
Yep, I do.
Dr. John Francis and I got somehow involved in this, what would you call it? Not a survey, but where they get a group of people together and they want to see how you react to certain things. And what it was, and I'm convinced the person who paid for it was Pensacola University, because there was a time when Bob Jones and Pensacola were vying for who's going to be the leader of the Independent Baptist. Well, Bob Jones was founded by a Methodist. It never even calls itself a Baptist school, but a lot of Independent Baptists sent their young people there. Pensacola was founded as a more of a Baptistic university than Bob Jones was, and it actually has the campus church, where the church is run by the school rather than the school run by the church, which is kind of a cart before the horse type thing, but that's a whole other area. But Bob Jones had made the decision, Bob Jones University, that we are not going to have a King James only position. Now,
Oh.
it didn't surprise me because Kim and I got invited to a missions conference in Erie, Pennsylvania, back in the early 90s, wasn't it? Probably
Yeah.
early 90s. And we're sitting there at breakfast. Bob Jones Jr. was sitting right here where Kim is, next to me, talking to the guy next to him. Now, the pastor of this church was an interesting guy. He said, I like to bring in people from different camps and then just watch how they interact. So I'm eating, I still remember, blueberry pancakes. And they're excellent. And so we were eating these blueberry pancakes, enjoying them, and I'm listening to the conversation. Bob Jones Jr., this is not secondhand, I heard somebody say that they heard that somebody said that they heard. I'm listening to him directly talk to this other guy, and Bob Jones Jr. said, we tell our people, meaning the people they train at Bob Jones University and send out to preach in churches, to only use the King James Bible because that's what the people expect. But when you're at home, use whatever you want. That was Bob Jones Jr. So you can see where the university went. They went away from the King James Bible. Pensacola at the time was becoming more King James only. Well, here Dr. Francis and I got invited to a panel discussion thing. And they said, we'll give you some money for your time. I think we each got $100. And we went up to Independent, of all places, and we went into this room, and they had cameras to watch where they could see everybody at the table. We were a long table, and there were some different pastors, mostly Baptists. This is why I think it was Pensacola, and the nature of some of the questions that were asked. And a lot of the questions kept coming back to the King James only. Well, those of you that knew Dr. Francis, he was a lot like Bruce Musselman in terms of on the King James Bible. He could tell you all kinds of stuff about it. So they were kind of drilling down on Dr.